Senator Kennedy's single inquiry regarding embezzled funds rendered Ilhan Omar completely silent. Over the past 3 decades, I have observed hundreds of congressional hearings from appropriations and judiciary panels to intelligence briefings that never reach the nightly broadcast. The vast majority of them are mere theatrical performances. Aides slide notes across desks, while lawmakers recite questions authored by entirely different individuals. It is essentially ambient chatter within a metropolis founded upon ambient chatter. However, this particular proceeding was uniquely different. A local anti-fraud commission in Minnesota formally requested that Representative Ilhan Omar provide testimony concerning a massive federal food program controversy occurring within her own constituency. She declined the invitation. The committee established a strict time frame for the submission of related paperwork, but she failed to meet that deadline. Consequently, they attempted to issue a legal subpoena to compel her appearance, but Democratic members of the panel prevented the measure from advancing. Later, a journalist from Fox News intercepted her in a Capitol corridor, inquiring whether she intended to assist with the investigation. She strolled right past the recording equipment, refusing to utter a solitary syllable. That amounted to 3 requests and 3 instances of absolute silence. Following this, Louisiana Senator John Kennedy directed a formal correspondence her way. In hindsight, she probably should have ignored that one as well, making it a 4th silent. Representative Omar declined to wait for an actual inquiry, nor did she wait for the strike of the gavel. Before Senator Kennedy could complete his introductory remark, she abruptly interrupted him. "This represents a politically driven witch hunt zeroing in on the Somali demographic, Senator," she declared. "It unfairly targets migrant households who arrived in this nation seeking improved circumstances. Furthermore, I absolutely refuse to remain seated here while individuals within this chamber exploit starving adolescents as a partisan tool to advance their Islamophobic narrative." She directed those accusations directly at the public. Consider the weight of that statement. Citizens merely desired to understand how their contributed revenues were being allocated. Taxpayers sought explanations as to why a national initiative designed to nourish youths had mutated into an illicit syndicate, yet she labeled those valid inquiries a witch hunt. She branded the pursuit of accountability as Islamophobia. Peering directly into a broadcast lens inside a facility funded by your hard-earned wages, she effectively declared that requesting transparency regarding pilfered public funds equates to prejudice. Retain that detail in your memory, because John Kennedy certainly did not forget it. The senator offered no immediate verbal retaliation. Instead, he scribbled a brief note along the edge of his legal pad. The edge of his lip twitched ever so faintly, not entirely a grin, but rather an expression of quiet validation. It was the distinct visage of an individual realizing that an adversary has articulated precisely what was anticipated. There is a crucial dynamic one must comprehend regarding John Kennedy. Whenever he becomes completely silent, he is by no means facing defeat, nor is he bewildered. Rather, he is meticulously calculating. He is assessing exactly how many escape routes the testifier has just securely bolted shut. He evaluates the dwindling number of available exit strategies. Once that tally approaches 0, he finally initiates his verbal offensive. "Representative, I am grateful for your attendance this afternoon," he began. "I merely possess a handful of straightforward inquiries, and subsequently, you may return to your schedule." Straightforward. That was the specific adjective he selected. For anyone who has ever observed this lawmaker interrogate a potential federal judge, or witnessed him systematically dismantle a high-ranking administration official, utilizing nothing beyond a sluggish southern cadence and a query suitable for a primary school student, the true definition of straightforward in Kennedy's vocabulary is abundantly clear. It signifies that the individual seated opposite him is on the precipice of enduring the most agonizing afternoon of their professional life. "You personally drafted a legislative measure recognized as the Meals Act. Is that accurate?" Kennedy asked. Omar verified the statement. Furthermore, that specific legislation, marking a premier occurrence in the initiative's operational history, permitted commercial, profit-driven dining establishments to engage in the National Youth Nourishment Program. Is that factual? "It secured approval with backing from both political parties, Senator," Omar replied. "It was formally enacted by President Trump. I comprehend that," Kennedy continued. Moreover, this identical stipulation additionally authorized what is termed grab-and-go food dispersal, indicating that nutritional provisions could be collected without any physical, face-to-face confirmation that the adolescents purportedly receiving the food actually existed. Is that also true? Representative Omar paused for a mere fraction of a moment before providing her affirmation. It is essential to grasp the gravity of that brief exchange. 3 binary, affirmative, or negative inquiries were posed. There were 0 allegations, 0 dramatic displays, and no amplification of vocal volume. Yet, within a mere 60 seconds, Kennedy effectively codified 3 undeniable truths under sworn testimony. She penned the legislation. That legislation stripped away fundamental security protocols, and consequently, taxpayer-funded sustenance could be handed out on behalf of fictitious minors. It is rare for an individual to be completely unraveled by basic affirmative or negative queries. However, she was already sustaining critical damage, entirely oblivious to her predicament. This highlights a tactic frequently misunderstood regarding Kennedy's methodology. He deliberately avoids opening with explosive allegations or leading with hostility. Instead, he methodically arranges undeniable realities that the individual must inevitably validate, as refuting them would constitute an easily demonstrable falsehood. Every confirmed statement acts as an individual masonry block. By the juncture the testifier comprehends they are balanced atop a towering barricade constructed entirely by Kennedy, descending safely is no longer a viable option. I have witnessed him execute this precise maneuver against a dozen individuals throughout his tenure. Astute subjects identify the rhythm by the 3rd inquiry and instinctively begin to equivocate. Those lacking that awareness continuously offer affirmations right up until the foundation vanishes completely. The senator extended his hand into a dossier. Extracting one solitary piece of paper, he positioned it evenly upon the desk, separating them, flattening it gently with his hand. "Representative, can you identify this document?" "I am unable to discern it from this distance, Senator," she replied. "It is a printed copy of the menu from a dining venue located in Minneapolis, known as the Safari Restaurant," Kennedy clarified. "Are you familiar with that establishment?" "I am familiar with many restaurants in my district, Senator. I have absolute confidence that you are," he stated. However, this specific eatery invoiced the national government for the staggering sum of $12 million via an initiative titled Feeding Our Future. $12 million allocated for youth nutrition, all channeled through one singular diner. He allowed the sheer magnitude of that figure to resonate heavily throughout the chamber. Furthermore, Representative, you hosted your 2018 campaign victory celebration at this exact establishment. Is that also correct? Omar adjusted her posture nervously. "I have organized gatherings at diverse locations throughout my district over the years," she defended. "Holding a campaign event at a restaurant does not imply knowledge of that restaurant's business activities." Kennedy angled his head slightly. "Does it not appear highly irregular to you, Representative, that the absolute largest fraud site in this entire investigation coincidentally aligns with the precise location where you commemorated your electoral triumph?" "Coincidences happen, Senator," she countered. "They do," Kennedy agreed. "They certainly do. But in my experience, when coincidences start stacking up in the same zip code, in the same district, with the exact same people, they stop being coincidences and they start being evidence." Omar offered 0 verbal counter to that assertion. She permitted the statement to hang unchallenged. That represented her second critical error. Her initial blunder was simply attending the proceeding. Kennedy offered a subtle nod, jotting down a note. He permitted her lack of response to linger heavily in the atmosphere, much like an undeniable stain setting into a pristine white tablecloth. It is glaringly obvious to everyone present. Nobody has to point it out. Subsequently, he delivered a remark in a hushed, nearly gentle tone. The specific cadence a Southern gentleman adopts immediately prior to delivering a deeply painful truth. $12 million, Congresswoman. "Do you know what that buys?" he asked. "That is, school lunches for every child in your district for 2 years. Every single one a hot meal, every day, for every kid who shows up to school hungry in Minneapolis. And somebody at that restaurant bought a Maserati with it. Somebody else bought property. Either lav, that's either money, either law. Either lav compare him and somebody else wired money overseas. And the children your law was written to protect went hungry while adults cashed checks with their names on the envelope." He placed the printed culinary list back onto the table, refusing to touch it again. It remained completely stationary for the duration of the inquiry. One page, face up. "I want you to remember that menu, as its significance becomes apparent later. If you are watching this, and have ever been forced to pack a lunch for your grandchild because the school meal was insufficient, you already feel what that number means. $12 million flowing through one restaurant. You should subscribe to this channel because what happened next is something the major networks chose not to show you. Kennedy then picked up a significantly thicker document. He held it so Omar and her legal counsel could see the cover page. "I have here copies of trial exhibits from the federal prosecution of Amy Bach," he announced. Mess. Bach was the founder and executive director of Feeding Our Future. She was convicted on multiple federal counts and sentenced 3 weeks ago to 41 years in federal prison. 41 years. The largest pandemic fraud sentence in American history. He opened the file. Among these exhibits are email exchanges between members of your congressional staff and individuals who have since been convicted of federal fraud in this case. I would like to read some of them into the record. He read specific dates and real name. He read subject lines that connected people in Omar's office to individuals who are now sitting in federal prison cells. He did not rush, choosing to read each one slowly. He gave Omar time to respond after every entry. She used that time to whisper to her counsel, to look down at her papers, to do practically anything except address what he had just entered into the congressional record. I want to tell you something about silence in a hearing room. Silence after a question is just dead air. It happens all the time. Witnesses think before they speak, and senators shuffle papers while nobody notices. But silence after evidence is distinctly different. Silence after evidence is the sound of a room full of people realizing that the person sitting in front of them does not have an answer, and everybody in that room heard it. "Senator, my office processes thousands of constituent communications every month," Omar finally stated. Responding to an email from a constituent is standard congressional practice. It is not evidence of participation in any criminal activity. "I agree with you entirely, Congresswoman," Kennedy replied. "An email response is not a crime. But these are not emails from people asking about potholes on Lake Street. These are communications with individuals who were systematically stealing federal money meant for children. And the woman who ran the entire operation, Amy Bach, told investigators under oath that you were, and I am quoting the trial record, likely aware of the billing irregularities in the program. Miss Bach is a convicted felon attempting to negotiate a reduced sentence, Senator," Omar shot back. "Her testimony carries no credibility. She received 41 years. Ma'am," Kennedy deadpanned. "I do not believe she is negotiating much of anything at this point." You could feel the shift in the room. It wasn't characterized by applause or gasps, but something quieter, the sound of people leaning back in their chairs and the sound of phones being put away because whatever was on those screens was not as important as what was happening 6 feet in front of them. I counted 3 staffers on Omar's side who had stopped writing entirely. One of them was staring blankly at the exit sign above the door. And then, Omar did something that almost worked. I genuinely mean that. I have watched a lot of counterattacks in hearing rooms. Most of them are desperate and obvious. But this one was genuine. For about 15 seconds, she commanded the room. She sat up straight, looked Kennedy directly in the eye, and delivered the strongest moment of her entire afternoon. "Senator Kennedy, let me make something very clear," she began forcefully. "President Donald Trump signed the legislation that contained my provision into law. President Trump's USDA secretary established the regulatory framework for how the program was implemented on the ground. President Trump's administration oversaw the rollout of every single aspect of this program. If you are genuinely interested in accountability, then perhaps you should direct your questions to the man who signed the law and the people he appointed to run it. I am going to be honest with you that defense landed. Trump did sign the initial Coronavirus Response Act. His USDA did write the implementation rules, and his administration did oversee the early months of the program. That was not political spin. That was historical fact. If Kennedy did not have an answer for this, the hearing was effectively finished. She knew it, and the Democrats in the room knew it. I could see 2 staffers on her side lean forward like they smelled blood in the water. Kennedy took a breath. 2 seconds of silence passed, not long enough to be a hesitation, but long enough to be a calculated decision. "Congresswoman, you make a fair point," he conceded. "The president signed the law, and his administration ran the program. That is accurate." Then his voice dropped half a register, becoming slower rather than louder. "But the president did not hold his election party at the Safari restaurant. The president did not exchange emails with Amy Bach. And the president did not refuse to testify when a state fraud committee asked him to come in and explain." Another second of silence. "You were invited by the Minnesota Fraud Prevention Committee to explain your connections to this case, and you refused. They gave you a deadline to provide documents, and you missed it. They moved to subpoena you, and your own party blocked the vote. A reporter asked you a direct question in the hallway of this very building, and you turned your back and walked away without saying a word. He set his pen down next to the menu. Congresswoman, 65 people have been convicted. The woman who ran the scheme is serving 41 years. Your legislation created the opening that made the fraud possible. You celebrated your election at the restaurant that cashed the biggest checks. Your office exchanged emails with defendants who are now in federal prison. And every single time somebody asked you to explain, you either refused to show up, blamed somebody else, or walked away in silence. He looked at the menu printout one more time. If you did nothing wrong, Congresswoman, why do you keep running? Share this story with someone who pays taxes, because they have a right to know where their money went. Omar pulled the microphone closer. When she finally spoke, her voice was controlled and careful. Every word was chosen by a woman who understood that she was now speaking for the congressional record and possibly for a future jury. Senator, 65 people were convicted in this case. I was not one of them, she stated. I have never been charged with any crime. I have never been named in any indictment, and I would appreciate it if you would stop implying guilt by geography. Kennedy nodded slowly. You are right, Congresswoman. You have not been charged, and I want to be fair to you about that. He looked at the menu on the table. But do you know who else had never been charged? Every single person connected to that restaurant, every person who filed those invoices, and every person who cashed those checks. None of them had been charged either. Right up until the moment they were. Representative Ilhan Omar slowly reached her trembling hand forward, her fingertips lightly grazing the dark, metallic base of the microphone positioned directly in front of her. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were desperately gathering the necessary breath to formulate a vigorous, impassioned defense. But then, abruptly and without a sound, she pushed the audio device away from her. A fleeting moment later, she reached for it a second time, wrapping her fingers around the slender neck of the microphone and pulling it back toward her mouth. 3 agonizingly long, heavily pregnant seconds passed in this paralyzed state. Her hand remained completely frozen on the heavy base of the device, her mouth hanging half open in a dramatic tableau of profound, inescapable indecision. I sat there in the gallery and watched a woman who had once confidently, fearlessly, and ferociously screamed, "You are a murderer!" directly at the sitting president of the United States during a highly publicized, nationally televised State of the Union address. Yet now, sitting in this remarkably quiet, unassuming congressional hearing room on a completely mundane Tuesday afternoon, she was completely, utterly, and devastatingly unable to produce a single, solitary word. The ferocious, unyielding political warrior was suddenly gone, replaced entirely by someone trapped hopelessly in the blinding headlights of undeniable reality. Ultimately, she pushed the microphone away for one final, definitive time. She did not reach for it again. The fight had entirely drained from her posture, leaving only the hollow shell of a defeated witness. Across the elevated wooden dais, Senator John Kennedy simply waited. He was not in a hurry. In fact, observing his long, storied career in politics, it becomes abundantly clear that he has never, ever been in a hurry. That is the distinct, defining characteristic about him that completely separates him from virtually every other elected senator currently working inside that sprawling marble building. Most other politicians consistently rush to their closing lines, speaking rapidly and desperately stepping on their own words, because they are terrified that their momentary television soundbite will pass them by. They harbor a deep, intrinsic fear of dead air. But Kennedy fundamentally and intrinsically trusts the silent. He genuinely understands that in a room constantly filled with partisan noise and performative outrage, silence actually does the heaviest, most devastating work of all. He allows the quiet to slowly expand, to seep into and fill the furthest corners of the chamber, to press down heavily on the shoulders of the witness until the sheer, suffocating weight of the unspoken truth becomes physically unbearable. When he finally broke that heavy silence and spoke again, his voice was not triumphant, boastful, or loud. It was incredibly quiet and painstakingly measured. It was exactly the way a thoughtful, observant man summarizes a complex, heartbreaking tragedy that he has been deeply pondering for a very long time. $250 million was stolen from hungry children. Congresswoman, he stated clearly, his voice slicing cleanly and decisively through the thick, tense atmosphere of the hearing room. You wrote the law that made it possible. You celebrated your election at the restaurant that cashed the checks. And when they asked you to explain, You ran. He paused deliberately to let the damning sequence of those undeniable facts settle permanently into the official congressional record. 1 second passed in total quiet. Then 2 full seconds ticked by. Then he delivered 7 final, crushing words, utilizing the exact same slow, rhythmic Louisiana drawl, the very same gentle, familiar cadence he might comfortably use to say a quiet grace before a Sunday evening dinner with his extended family. The children were hungry. You were not. Representative Omar stood up from her leather chair. She did not shout in protest. She did not violently slam her hand down upon the wooden table in a display of righteous indignation. And she certainly did not aggressively point her finger to publicly call anyone a murderer or a liar, perfectly mirroring the exact theatrical way she had behaved at the State of the Union just 5 short months earlier. Instead, she quietly and methodically gathered her scattered documents, shuffling them into an uneven, disorganized stack. She pressed the thick folders tightly against her chest like a protective, physical shield, and began walking briskly toward the side exit of the grand chamber. Her legal counsel quickly followed, trailing exactly 3 steps behind her in silent solidarity. Neither of them dared to look back over their shoulders. There was absolutely no emotional outburst, no sharp parting shot meant for the waiting cameras, and crucially, there were no press photographers stationed at that particular side door, because absolutely nobody in the entire building expected her to leave through it. Every other time Representative Ilhan Omar has departed a room while under intense political fire, she has inevitably left it accompanied by a massive storm of noise, a flurry of loud, defensive accusations, and her finger pointed aggressively in someone's face. This specific time, however, she left the exact way that guilty individuals leave when they possess the crushing, terrifying realization that the television cameras are going to endlessly replay whatever action they take next for the entire remainder of their professional careers. That is precisely how you know, without a shadow of a doubt, that the confrontation was truly and completely over. When a figure as historically vocal and constantly combative as Ilhan Omar has absolutely nothing left to scream, it means that Ilhan Omar has absolutely nothing left in her political arsenal. Subscribe to this independent channel, because every single week there is a critical, deeply revealing hearing taking place in Washington, D.C., that the major, mainstream television networks actively and purposely choose not to cover. And the next explosive proceeding is already marked firmly on the schedule. Consider the staggering, horrifying statistics of this massive criminal enterprise. 65 individuals have been formally convicted in a court of law. A staggering $250 million was aggressively and systematically stolen from a crucial federal program that was originally supposed to feed vulnerable, hungry children. 41 years in a grim federal penitentiary was the unprecedented sentence handed down for the woman who masterminded and ruthlessly ran the entire illicit operation. And in the bustling city of Minneapolis right now, specifically within the designated borders of the 5th Congressional District of Minnesota, there are innocent, struggling children who are forced to walk to their school buildings in the freezing morning without having eaten a single, nourishing bite of breakfast. This heartbreaking, entirely preventable reality is not occurring because there is no government program available to help them. There absolutely is a federally funded program in existence, but the critical funding that was supposed to sustain it was ruthlessly stolen by greedy, manipulative adults. These criminals literally put fake, fabricated children's names onto fraudulent, bloated invoices for hot meals that were never actually cooked, never once served, and never eaten by anyone. Who ultimately funded this massive, unprecedented theft? Elderly retirees surviving day to day on strictly fixed, limited incomes paid for it. Brave military veterans who returned home from serving this country overseas, only to face mounting local property taxes and skyrocketing prescription medication bills, paid for it. Hardworking, exhausted mothers who faithfully hand over a third of every single paycheck to the massive federal government every April 15th paid for it. Their hard-earned, desperately needed tax money was supposed to magically transform into nutritious lunch trays, cold milk cartons, and warm, comforting cheese sandwiches carefully wrapped in wax paper for the most vulnerable, defenseless members of our society. Instead, $12 million of that exact, targeted funding was funneled directly and illegally through a single, solitary restaurant. The very same restaurant where a sitting congresswoman joyously celebrated getting elected to her powerful, influential office. Senator Kennedy calmly walked out the side door after the hearing officially concluded. There were no boastful television interviews and no chaotic, shouting hallway press gaggle waiting to swarm him. He firmly declined to take any questions from the assembled reporters. He simply departed the premises, his task completely finished. Meanwhile, the stark black and white printout of the Safari restaurant menu remained perfectly stationary on the witness table, and absolutely nobody bothered to pick it up or file it away. When I casually walked past the empty, echoing hearing room an entire hour later, that damning piece of evidence was still sitting exactly there, completely undisturbed by the bustling Capitol staff. It was just one single, lonely sheet of paper, resting face up under the harsh fluorescent lights, with two damning, unmistakable words clearly printed at the very top: Safari Restaurant. She personally wrote the specific legislation that essentially unlocked the door to this devastating, widespread fraud. She happily and publicly celebrated her political victory at the exact establishment that brazenly walked through it to steal millions. And when the authorities finally sat her down under oath and asked her to simply explain her undeniable proximity to the crime, she cowardly ran away in complete, total silence. That is absolutely everything you will ever need to know about this tragic, infuriating situation.